Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in it and join in the fun. Travel all over Australia.
This week we have quite a variety of stories for you. Did you know they grew tea in Australia? Well, up here at Innisfail, in North Queensland, not far from Mount Bartle, they grow tea at the Nerada tea plantation. Then we go down to Port Macquarie on the north coast of New South Wales and have a look at Fantasy Glades, an area especially set aside for children.
Have you ever been aggravated by the noise of mini bikes running around at the weekend? Well, if you have, you might find our final story rather interesting. Here at Awabba, we see what's been done to organise a club of young children with mini bikes. You'll also be surprised at just how well they can ride, I think.
Everybody likes a nice cup of tea, but you can't always have one in the middle of a tea plantation. We're in North Queensland to answer 2 letters. One from Mrs. Perkins of Smithfield in New South Wales, and the second one from Mrs. Harrington in Plympton Park, South Australia. They both wrote to ask about tea plantations. Mrs. Harrington wrote, "Recently a friend returning from a holiday in Queensland brought with her a carton of Nerada tea, and I was more than surprised to learn that tea was grown in Australia, as the carton explained, on the slopes of Queensland's highest mountain, Mount Bartle. Incidentally, the brew was delicious and comparable to many imported expensive varieties. I'll be most grateful if you could include in your program at some future date a trip to where this tea is grown in Queensland." Well, Mrs. Harrington, we're going to have a look at the production of Nerada tea.
The Nerada tea gardens were commenced in 1959 by Dr. Alan Maroof of Innisfail, who saw in Nerada a uniquely suitable area for tea growing. The tea plantation is now owned by Tea Estates of Australia. Nerada is 20 miles west of Innisfail at the foothills of Mount Bartle. These giant tea picking machines were developed here for the harvesting of the tea. The tea can be harvested in virtually any weather conditions, as the soil drains well. Three harvesting machines work to clip the fresh tips of tea leaves from the bushes. I spoke to the marketing manager of Tea Estates of Australia, Rod Taylor.
Full production going onto the Australian market has only occurred since about 1974.
Rod, once you've planted the tea bush, how long is it before you can actually take the first harvest?
About 3 or 4 years, Mike, before you get any significant harvest at all. And you reach maximum maturity at about 8 years.
How old would these ones be here?
These are 1970 bushes, and we clip that every 10 days, right through the year, and the bushes last up to 100 years.
100 years. And this flower here that's on the bush, that's the...
Yes, that's the camellia. And tea is a relative of the camellia family.
Is it? I didn't know that.
That's a beautiful little white camellia.
All of this tea here is all picked by machine, but I mean overseas...
Yes, entirely.
It's mostly hand-picked, isn't it?
That's right. We're the most mechanised plantation in the world, and each harvester does the work of about 120 tea pickers in Indonesia and Sri Lanka and India and these other places.
And why does it grow here? Is it the weather conditions that are perfect?
Oh yes,
here?
every condition is perfect here. Rainfall, we're averaging 200 inches of rain a year since we've been producing tea. The soil is marvellously fertile and well drained and very high acidic factor. And in fact, tea growing here, the conditions are optimum.
We were told that if all the tea hedges were placed end to end, they would run for 5. Once withering has taken place, the leaves are put through a rotor vane, which crushes the cells in the tea leaves and reduces the leaves to size. The leaf does not remain whole, it is broken up or crushed into small pieces suitable for packaging. Exposure of the leaf's juices to the air encourages oxidization. The juices, being sticky, cling to the leaf particles as they dry out in the oxidization process. This is where the tea flavour comes from. The tea is passed through an oven with hot air blowing up through the leaves to encourage the drying process. A conveyor belt carries the dried tea into the sorting room. Some rubbish, such as stalks, are removed here by static electricity. This huge shaker separates the tea into various grades and quality. The best tea goes through another static electric cleaning process that ensures that only the best quality tea is packed at Nerada. The market demand for Nerada tea is so high that it is only sold in some Queensland stores and 2 other chain stores in Victoria and South Australia. The demand is almost 10 times the supply. When boiling water is poured onto the tea leaves, the dried juice of the leaf is dissolved and drunk as tea. The pot of tea should always be served within 5 or 10 minutes of making to achieve the optimum tea flavour. A tea house on the plantation sells packaged Nerada tea in various forms, from tea bags to the highest quality premium, named after the Premier of Queensland.
Well, that's the Nerada tea story. A fascinating new industry for Australia. We're in Port Macquarie because 9-year-old Leanne Snowden of Miranda in Sydney says she would very much like to see Snow White's village in Port Macquarie. Well, Leanne, we found the place you mean, but it's not called Snow White's village, it's called Fantasy Glades. We're going to have a look at it now.
Fantasy Glades lives up to its name. It is a delightful 5 acres of fantasy, where children can imagine they live in a shoe and visit the Seven Dwarfs cottage. The Glades are the brainchild of a dwarf couple, Rose and George Whittaker.
George and Rose Whittaker started Fantasy Glades. Now, Rose, when was it that Fantasy Glades actually started off, and what made you decide to make it along the lines of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?
Well, my late husband, George, had been in show business all his life, practically, since he left school until we were married. He came over from England in 1960 touring with Snow White, and this is when I met him, when my parents took me to see the show. Our life went from that to this, and we eventually got married, and that time we lived in Sydney. And George, once he'd settled down to married life, decided that he'd had enough of touring and show business. We found Port Macquarie, and, well, at the time, Fantasy Glades was just bushland. There was nothing else here. We decided to start a tourist attraction that we hoped would be a delight for both children and adults. And as George had worked with Snow White all his life, we tried to base it around Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
A miniature church is set in the centre of the glades. Services are held here when the Little People's Association of Australia get together for their annual conventions. Rose and George started the Little People's Association a few years ago and now have members from all over Australia. The annual convention was held here this year.
We're just going to have a look at the Seven Dwarfs mine.
The most popular attraction at Fantasy Glades is the walk-in mine that houses Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs animated display. The popular fairy tale of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was first written down 150 years ago by two German brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. The brothers Grimm wrote other fairy tales, but the story of Snow White is the best known. It goes like this.
Once upon a time there was a beautiful girl known as Snow White, whose stepmother was a wicked and jealous queen. The wicked queen hated Snow White because her magic mirror had told her that Snow White was the most beautiful person in all the world. In a jealous rage, the queen sent a huntsman to take Snow White into the woods and kill her. The huntsman could not do such a cruel thing, so he left Snow White in the woods. She was so frightened that she ran and ran, not knowing which way to go. Suddenly she came to a lovely little house, tucked away among
seen the Seven Dwarfs mine, a visit to Snow White's cottage is a must. This is a very popular spot with the children. It doesn't need much imagination to make this the real Seven Dwarfs cottage. Upstairs you will find Snow White's bedroom. Everything at Fantasy Glades is like a fairy tale. It is fast becoming a regular place to see with people who visit Port Macquarie.
As I said, George did die recently, unfortunately, and now I hope to be able to continue with our wonderful park that he started. He designed all the things in it, and I do hope, well, I know I'll continue on with it forever, as far as I can anyway, for my children.
anybody who's lived in a suburban area anywhere in Australia is fairly familiar with that sort of sound. I guess from time to time they've heard the noise of bikes and children running around on them. And a number of people have written to us on Ask the Leyland Brothers and asked us about organised groups where people can use these bikes. This particular letter comes from Michael Clifford from Parramatta in New South Wales. And he says, I would like to know if there are any organised groups where children can use mini bikes legally. Well, there certainly are. There are a number of them all over Australia. But to see what these clubs do and how they teach the children to ride, we've come to the Lake Macquarie Mini Bike and Cycle Training Association's training ground here near Lake Macquarie. And we're going to talk now with Athol Parsons, the president. Athol, perhaps you'd like to answer some of these questions for Michael. He wants to know a little bit about what your club does. So what are the objectives of the club, really?
The objectives, Mel, are actually to teach the young riders right from the beginner stage to the full competition stage later in life, and also to help them learn the rights and the wrongs, and preferably the rights for road sense when they get out onto our public roads and highways in their latter years.
And just how safe is it, Athol?
Well, it's very safe. We've been operating for 4 years now, and we've had no accidents, no serious accidents whatsoever. We do insist that the riders wear long trousers, long sleeve shirts, good safety helmet and very good protective footwear, which is very essential. Anyone that's tied up with motorcycling and that will understand that they can be dangerous, they can be a lethal weapon if not controlled and in a safe manner. And at the beginning of the day when bikes arrive, they're placed in the pit area where our scrutineers go over these bikes to check them for safety before they do go out for competition.
The checking of each bike includes brakes, tyres, wheel spokes, adjustment of clutch and a general check for nuts and bolts that may be loose. Each rider's own protective clothing is also checked. Bikes with major problems are prohibited from use and cannot use the club's training grounds again until the fault is repaired. The club members range from 5-year-olds just learning about cycles up to 17-year-olds who can be considered old hands by comparison. Learners and inexperienced riders are taught how to ride and have their own isolated area for tuition. Some of these children are having their first lesson today, and already the system of safety, signals and flags is being taught. When enough handling experience is acquired, the younger riders graduate to using the many winding bush tracks which crisscross the 100-hectare club grounds. The tracks wind in all directions through the bush, and free riding time on these tracks is one of the most popular pastimes of the club members. Once more though, there are rules, and the bikes must set off with reasonable space between them, give signals to stop, and observe any flag instructions that may be given by the adult supervisors spaced throughout the tracks. This free trail riding is what most kids want their cycles for in the first place. But here, isolated from settled areas, they can roar their engines like a squadron of mosquitoes all day without disturbing anyone. And it's just as much fun on the smallest of bikes. Organised competitive events are also run by the club, and it's through this type of activity that rider confidence and skill is developed. Although boys outnumber girls in the club, there's a large number of girls just the same, and they often outperform the boys in competition. Point score days are held once a month, where all activity for the day is organised, but the club committee tries to provide a combination of free riding with competitive events. After all, with too many rules, the kids may think the fun is being organised out of it. One of the most skillful events for the more advanced riders is the trials riding. The object of this is to complete the rough, bumpy and hilly course without the rider placing his foot on the ground. Points are deducted for each touch of the ground. If 2 riders complete the course without the loss of a point, then the fastest time wins the event. The handling skill of some of these youngsters would put many a licensed cycle rider to shame. The most spectacular competitive event for spectators is the cross-country moto. The 6 riders must complete 5 laps of the obstacle course, and with the sizzling pace they set, it's difficult to believe that these children are not professional dirt track riders. The parents of these children must be just as devoted as the kids to put the time and effort into running the club. But by the time these youngsters are old enough to hold a licence to ride a motorbike, they have all the crazy showing off burned out of them, here, in safety, and without upsetting neighbours in suburban back streets.
Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in and then join in the fun. Travel all over Australia.